Is it time to sell Google stock? Partly because, look, the competitive pressure has been turned up. You see Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella saying a direct quote, "I want people to know that we made them dance," talking about Google making them react to their investments in AI search. And I think he has a little bit of a right to be cocky here because Microsoft has invested billions of dollars into OpenAI. They successfully launched ChatGPT, which is one of the fastest growing consumer apps ever, with 100 million monthly active users within 2 months of launch. This really has caught Google by surprise, both with how quickly it's been adopted, but also how good their AI is, this large language model. Now, Google tried to get right back into the limelight, with a 60 Minutes interview this past weekend, Sundar Pichai talking to the interviewer, saying like, look, we got all sorts of things. We got robots, we got Bard, which is Google's response to ChatGPT. And it's clear that they're sort of pulling back a little bit. They're not, showing everything that they have in terms of the latest cutting edge. And it does strike me that they're afraid. They're afraid at how powerful this could be if you were to push this into full society, sort of say, hey, let's take the greatest technology we have, or even better, let's everyone race to compete with trying to launch like super intelligent AI. And it's very clear from that interview that Google is hesitant. They want to be cautious about it, saying it's not for a company to decide sort of the concerns that maybe regulators need to step into place. And you've seen this from several other players like Elon Musk as well, sort of saying, you know what, maybe regulators should be stepping in because of how powerful AI could become in the years ahead. Now, let's just look at where Google's Bard is, at least their public solution, versus ChatGPT. And I'm asking a very relevant question for you if you're tuning in. Can you discuss Google and what will likely drive shareholder returns in the future? Now, this is Google's solution, Bard. And the answer is very, I'd say it's okay, but it misses the mark. It's saying continued growth in advertising revenue. Yes, that's right. Expansion to new markets. Yes. Investment in research and development, strong management team. These last two are very nebulous. I would say, it's a passing grade, but I wouldn't say it gets an A+ or anything like that. Now, let's look at what ChatGPT said with this exact same prompt, and it's a lot more detailed, a lot more nuanced. This is using GPT-4, where they talk about their core advertising business, much more detailed. They talk about what are the actual products in their advertising business, like Google Search, YouTube, Google Display Network. Then they also talk about cloud computing, something that wasn't even brought up with Google Bard's response. Then they talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that how this could unlock new opportunities in autonomous vehicles, natural language processing models, like what we're seeing here, personalized content and advertising. I mean, this is so much of a better nuanced answer. I'd say this is the A+ answer. Google Bard is maybe a C, maybe a C+ when I would think about it. Maybe I'm being too harsh with the grading. I welcome your feedback. Also talk about hardware, something that, you're looking at stuff where even if it's not 100%, talking about Google Stadia, I think Google Stadia was subsequently canceled now. OpenAI, with ChatGPT, that does have a cutoff date of September 2021, whereas Google Bard is based on, I think, more recent data. So, there are mix and matches, but overall, when you look at what Microsoft has invested here, this solution with OpenAI and ChatGPT is just worlds better than what we've seen with Bard so far. Now, maybe that's because Google, is afraid to launch what they fully have, and they're afraid they can't contain it. I don't know. Now, let's think about these different markets, because you have search and you have generative AI. And with search, you have you might be searching for the most recent data. You might have multimedia, videos, pictures, maps. You might be looking for greater accuracy or verification, linking to, let's say, a source document. Okay, what's the answer to this? I want to link directly to the source document. So that is the search market. This is part of the search market that I don't think gets disrupted over time. Right now, when you're talking about ChatGPT, you're not talking about, let's say, hey, I want to see these pictures, or I want to see this video, or I want to see these locations on the map. That is something where Google still has a very strong value proposition. 1 billion+ users using Google Maps every day. So that's a really important data point. So I'm not saying generative AI is going to absolutely crush Google, but what I am saying is there is some overlap, and we'll talk about that overlap in just a second. So you have search, then you have generative AI, and so that has conversational appeal. It can synthesize information in a very clear way, like we just saw with Google. Like, hey, can you synthesize, explain, can you summarize? What are the key points that shareholders should consider for Google stock? Boom, these are the key things to watch. it can retrieve very specific requests. If you want to say, hey, what's the revenue? How did it change? Why did it change? Asking questions like that. You can also have content creation, and this is where there's a lot of creativity here that can be really fun. And I think there's going to be this is like an explosion of creativity that you're going to see from humanity from generative AI. Like there can be like, hey, instead of those sort of scammy psychic numbers that you can call, be like, hey, why not talk to psychic GPT? Like, tell me what's going to happen. And like recognize that it's probably just going to be as accurate as calling a super expensive, hotline number. Call me now. And so you have that aspect. Or maybe you have like, you want to write a poem, or you want to draft up legal documents, or, you want to, interpret your dream, or just have someone to, take something off, you have a lot on your mind. You want to share what are your thoughts, and, you can have a conversation there. So I look at this, and I'm not saying it's going to completely take over search. What I'm saying is it's probably actually a much, much bigger market than search over time, in time, based on how many different fields, how many different products it can touch. And that I think is a consensus, when you talk to, or you at least listen to the leadership like Sundar Pichai at Google, where he's like, look, it's going to impact everything. And so that's what does make me think long term, this is actually an even bigger market. Now, the question is, well, how much does it impact? What is the overlap? And keep in mind, these aren't necessarily to scale. I'm trying to make a point that I think generative AI is going to be much bigger than search, and search is already a big, $100 billion plus market. So the question is, how much is the overlap? Is it just a little? Is it a lot? And, the overlap instances, or, it can be an example where it's easier to get a single answer. If you do a Google search, sometimes it's like, oh, here's a list, here's a bunch of advertisements, here's a couple of web pages. And with generative AI, it could say, no, here is the top answer, and here's the other top 3 if you want a list. And that can be much more helpful and visually appealing than, boom, you got advertisements, you have a bunch of little links you might need to click through. Oh, this is a video that you have to pop up to answer this. Like, hey, how do you pronounce something? You might have to pull up one of these annoying YouTube videos that you might say, well, this doesn't actually answer. I have to listen to this for 15 seconds before it actually tells me how to pronounce something. So I look at this and I'm thinking there is going to be some share that gets impacted. Also, perhaps with the use of AI agents, you can skip the need for some searches altogether. And that is something we haven't quite seen yet, but I think that's going to be a huge market in the coming quarters and years, where you have something like ChatGPT directly plugged in to, let's say, a travel agency or travel, network like a booking.com, where you can say, hey, let's use ChatGPT. Give me 3 options for a great trip to Hawaii. And I want to see the costs, and I want to see cars, and ChatGPT can do that for you, and then say, okay, here are the 3, and would you like to pay for it right now? And that'll be very different than people saying, oh, I'm going to search for a trip to Hawaii. And so I do think you're going to see part of the market get impacted, with the search market. I think clearly the search market is going to need some sort of overhaul, given that you can now integrate, really smart AI. So the question is, where does Google stock go from here? Well, first, in full disclosure, this is not financial advice. And also, quick plug, I just started buying a stock that I think has over 300% upside that I called out to my subscribers at unrivaledinvesting.com. I also expect to raise prices soon, so now's the time to act if you'd like to lock in a favorable rate and take charge of your investment journey. That's at unrivaledinvesting.com. So let's keep going into what's going on with Google. So when you think about the largest sort of end markets that are advertising on Google search, things like travel and tourism, that definitely can get disrupted in the future. Think about education. Education is definitely going to see an overhaul in the future with ChatGPT, in my opinion. The appeal of and the cost structure of college and the marketing of these for-profit educational institutions, I think that's going to change dramatically when you can ask a lot more questions, and for a much lower price can get access to ChatGPT and the answers there. So and you're already starting to see that with Khan Academy starting to bring in ChatGPT to sort of say, hey, this can be your tutor. So I think education is going to get an overhaul. I think that, by the way, that's great for society. I think that'll help with inflationary costs, and we've seen education costs have spiraled out of control over the last few decades. Health and wellness, that's another key part of the economy that's spending a lot on search and advertising. I think that health is definitely going to be impacted. I think doctors are going to love how much help they can get from ChatGPT, being able to diagnose, sort of say, hey, this is what's going on. Or maybe it's effectively a triage solution. Maybe you use ChatGPT as a triage to tell you, okay, this is what needs to happen right now. And it even gives a recommendation, and then it's just up to the doctor to review the evidence and say, oh yeah, this makes sense or not. And their productivity jumps manyfold. So I think I think all these end markets that are advertising on Google, they're going to, or a lot of them, they're going to say, it's unclear that the advertising spend is going to stay the same. And that is increased uncertainty. Now you do look at, like, for example, something like automotive, that I'm not quite seeing the disruption there unless you start seeing a lot of like autonomous vehicles. They do talk about how, and keep in mind, this is a prompt from ChatGPT on like what are the top, verticals that are spending on Google search. Now they currently spend for brand awareness and to generate leads. But could you start seeing a marketing push from ChatGPT in the future where they say, hey, based on these queries, we know you're dealing with someone that is interested in learning about these types of trucks or has XYZ income based on these types of queries. Could this generate favorable leads for the automotive? So I think this whole sector is way more uncertain. And that's I think the important takeaway from this video is that the certainty that one had with Google in the prior years, that Google would just keep marching higher, that's a lot less certain. I think you're looking at a changing competitive dynamic, not only from Microsoft, looking to get more involved with search, but also just how will generative AI impact a lot of these markets and how people will actually look for things. Now, Google, once again, they're dancing now. They're reacting. And so you see reports saying, oh yeah, there's Project Codename Maggie, where they're looking to release a new AI-powered search tool within the next month. So this does reflect that Google's trying to react, trying to, say, hey, we will be the leader again in this space in terms of, and look, they haven't lost their market share, but they are very aware that there are better solutions than what they have out there, at least for generative AI with ChatGPT versus Bard. And it's it's unsure how this ultimately plays out. And I just shared a few different specific verticals that could be impacted over time with Google search. Not saying everything, but saying some things could get impacted. And, once again, talking about the changing uncertainty, dealing with a tougher competitor, that is clearly something that wasn't priced in a year or two ago. And you're seeing, headlines yesterday about how, Google stock was dipping based on reports that Samsung might switch to Microsoft Bing search. And this is an example where Microsoft's saying, hey, let's just invest in this. Let's try to gobble up some market share. And we're going to invest so that way the default screen when you're using Samsung, which has something like 20% market share of smartphones in the world, and so maybe it's 10% total of advertising, advertising share for Google search, rough figures between 10 and 20%. That could be impacted if Microsoft pays enough and they're saying, hey, we can run this at break even, whereas Google's running this at 40% margins. Let's run this at break even just to grow as quickly as possible because we have all these other businesses that are doing great. Microsoft can do that. That's a huge advantage. That's to be able to say, hey, we'll take the profits from these other segments to completely disrupt this other market that we think is just ginormous. That's super clever. So that is a risk that I think Google shareholders need to be mindful of. And, what happens if Samsung does switch to Microsoft Bing as the default? And then will users stick with it? Or will users say, no, just Google's, so much better. I'm not going to use Microsoft Bing. I personally think that's still the case, that a lot of users will say, hey, I just like Google more. But let's walk through some of the numbers when we think about Google. Now, keep in mind, this is a hypothetical valuation framework. Of course, stock price can go way higher, way lower. A lot depends on sentiment. A lot depends on the execution. But the key takeaway looking at this, currently $1.3, $1.4 trillion company. This is still a huge mega company when you're looking at Alphabet. When you're looking at the different pieces, Google services and their ad business is still, that's the key driver here. Even if Google Cloud is very successful, based on using a variety of, outcomes, variety of different assumptions, maybe you're talking about $100 billion valuation. Maybe you're talking about $300 billion, even higher than my high side. It's not really as much that's going to move the needle. So what's really going to drive a compelling return, if the current market cap is around 1.3, 1.4 trillion, is saying, hey, they're going to keep growing their core ad businesses, which let's say is currently around $1 trillion. So the core return is going to come from the cash flows. Will management return, let's say 4 or 5% of their free cash flow to shareholders each year and buy back stock? And will they generate a multiple return on their ad business, their core Google services? Could this be a $3 trillion business in the years ahead? That would be the dramatic upside potential that I don't have here. And I've moderated my own expectations for Google services in the years ahead based on this increasingly dynamic and competitive environment. Now, they also have equity and cash. I'm not giving them a lot of credit for some of these other bets. Maybe there's a lot more value here. But once again, given that Google's such a big company, $1.3, $1.4 trillion, it's hard to move the needle as much as their core advertising businesses, their Google services. That's going to be what needs to drive it. Now, looking at the combination of cash plus the different assumptions here, and we'll talk about Google services in just a second. Looking at this, I'm effectively saying maybe it's around break even over the next 5 years. Maybe, it compounds at a, mid-teens rate, maybe it even closer to 20% rate over the next few years. So this is an okay setup. It's not as compelling as some of the other things, I'm personally looking at, but look, in full disclosure, when I look at Google, and I've seen this in the last few months, I bought some, when it dipped below 90, because I was saying, okay, I think the valuation here is very compelling. But as I've sort of seen these dynamics play out with generative AI, and I see how fast it's developing, particularly with ChatGPT, how fast they're moving there, how fast they're iterating, and how really offside, Google is. Like Google, they've just not executed, in my opinion, so far. Bard is not anywhere near as good. And so I looked at that. So when I bought a little bit more Google, below $90 a share, I also sold recently, and I trimmed it significantly because of this increased uncertainty. Now, that might be a mistake, and let's talk about, Google's business, going forward, where, you're looking at, I'm thinking about margins of between, let's say 34 to 38%. Recently, it's been a little closer to the low end of that. For this next year, it's unclear where it shapes up to be. Do you have a type of recession where it actually declines? Do you actually start seeing some growth? It's unclear where this responds. But the truth is, I'm assuming in my high case that their core Google services grows 12%, and pretty much everything else, the base and low case, it's much slower growth. And so if Google is able to grow their core advertising businesses, their core Google services at a teens rate, then you probably, there's a very good chance that Google does well if they're able to grow and able to maintain their high margins that they previously did. I'm assuming 18 times and multiple 5 years from now. But if they don't deliver on that growth, then, I think you look at a stock that doesn't perform crazy well. It doesn't have that dramatic upside. And I think this is part of the reason why I trim my position, for right or wrong, is that the picture has changed dramatically from the thesis when I initially invested. And when new data comes, it's important to change your mind. And so when I see Microsoft saying, hey, we're looking to make you dance, we're willing to make these investments, and challenging things like, with Samsung, that's a big deal. 10 to 20% of the Google search market, probably, I'd probably guess closer to 10%. That could get impacted there. And so just a small change in terms of growth rates for something like Google could impact, the valuation. And if you have, let's say, a combination of a recession and potential, these existential risks as well, could you have a situation where Google drops significantly and reaches an even lower valuation? Because then you have a recession, and then folks are worried about, hey, there's these competitive risks. So I look at this and I think it's very possible you see an even lower valuation ahead. But at this point, I still own a small amount of Google. It's a teaser position. It's not going to be the key driver of my portfolio. But because I like a lot of their business, and I think a lot of their business will not get disrupted and still has strong growth, drivers ahead, like Google Maps, for example. But there's a lot more uncertainty now. And so I think I'm personally, before I consider, let's say, making it a much bigger part of my portfolio again, I want to see how some of these cards play out. I want to see how this very uncertain dynamic in terms of this industry plays out. Is Microsoft going to be able to capture a lot of share? Let's see how that plays out in the next quarter or two. If you have a different opinion or think I'm being too cautious here on Google. I definitely would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching Unrivaled Investing.